Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, the Non-GMO Project Express for Dietary Supplements. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Marcy Burton, Business Development Manager for Consumer Values Verified here with NSF. The Consumer Values Verified team is a division of NSF focused on label claim certification services such as non-GMO, as well as a portfolio of other consumer value-centric programs, whether it's lifestyle, religious, or dietary needs. And this includes our gluten-free program, certified plant-based, and a few others. I have my master's in crop and soil science, and I work closely with the Non-GMO Project, NSF gluten-free, certified plant-based, and other label claim programs. I've been with NSF for the last 5 years, with a previous role as a technical reviewer for the Non-GMO Project program. And today I'm going to share a bit of what I've learned. So it is important to note that NSF operates independently from the Non-GMO Project. NSF is a third-party technical administrator for the Non-GMO Project. And NSF is committed to professional, efficient, and independent certification activities, and we leave the advocacy work to the advocates. So today's highlight is the Non-GMO Project Verification Program. The Non-GMO Project is a nonprofit organization that's committed to providing the highest standards for non-GMO verification and GMO avoidance. The Non-GMO Project requires ongoing testing of ingredients that are high risk of being genetically modified, even if organic. And upon verification to the Non-GMO Project, companies can use the butterfly label on verified products. So the Non-GMO Project claim and butterfly logo is the fastest growing label in the natural channel by a wide margin. In terms of the growth of the Non-GMO Project label, there are currently more than 3,600 brands making more than 50,000 products that have chosen to achieve this claim. And what is their reward? Sales of Non-GMO Project verified items have been on an extreme growth curve and approaching $26 billion annually now. So it's important to note that the current Non-GMO Project licensing agreement is for products to be marketed in the U.S. or Canada, and there may be an option for an international expanded licensing agreement. So there are 4 main pillars to the Non-GMO Project, and that is compliant inputs, segregation and cleanout, traceability, and testing for high-risk inputs. The Non-GMO Project is a very much process-based standard. However, only individual products can carry the claim. So the standard looks at product-level compliance through compliant inputs, and these compliant inputs must come out of a compliant quality management system with principles and protocols for traceability, segregation, and cleanout to avoid contamination or commingling with GM materials. So the application process here at NSF looks like this. So first you would contact me to get started with the basic information on your products that would be seeking certification. The formulas are evaluated based on the weight of each ingredient with any added water or salt removed. We look at the ingredient documentation and facility information to confirm the systems that are in place. There may be an on-site inspection required, but it's not required for every operation. That depends on the risk of the ingredients in your product as well as the percentage of those ingredients. And we'll dive more into that as we go. So upon certification, again, you can use that butterfly logo on your package, and your products are also listed on the Non-GMO Project website and searchable by the UPC code. You also receive a certificate of verification for each product by brand. So let's get into the overview on the requirements. So the first step is compliant inputs. And the first step to understanding if your inputs are compliant is to classify them according to the Non-GMO Project standard. So ingredients are classified by risk, and then they also are classified by the percentage in the finished product to determine what is needed based on the risk and the percentage. So a non-risk input is a material that is not derived from biology, and it's not therefore susceptible to genetic modification. So we can think about salts, minerals, synthetic compounds from hydrocarbons, where there really isn't DNA for it to even be modified. Low-risk inputs are inputs that are derived from biological organisms that are not on the monitored or high-risk list. So essentially there's no known commercially available version of genetically modified version of that specific ingredient. An important question to ask yourself when you're looking at your ingredients, does the ingredient have any high-risk sub-ingredients? So any high-risk sub-ingredient is also evaluated, and the requirements are based on that sub-ingredient percentage in your finished product. For monitored risk inputs, these are ingredients that are perhaps under development or in research for for GM versions of that organism, but they are not widely commercially available. So ingredients on the monitored risk may be elevated to the high-risk list, and we did see that recently with the potato. So the potato was on the monitored risk for a few years, and just last year it was elevated to high risk. So a high-risk input. Now these are inputs that there are GM versions widely commercially available. And we'll just run through the list here. So these include certain crops. So the high-risk crops are alfalfa, canola, corn, cotton, papaya, soy, sugar beets, zucchini, and yellow summer squash. So these are the high-risk crops. But any derivatives of those high-risk crops are also high risk. So corn syrup, corn maltodextrin, sugar beet molasses, soy oil. Another category of high-risk ingredients are livestock, bee, and aquaculture products. And it is important to note that compliance for those products is demonstrated through the animal feed. Other high-risk inputs include amino acids, vitamins, yeast products, microbial growth media, and that's due to the source of a lot of these ingredients being one of the high-risk crops or animal-derived ingredients. There's also a category of non-testable high-risk ingredients, and these are some of the high-risk ingredients that are using some of the new biotechnology techniques. So this includes the potato, canola, soy from the talon, and we have microbes and enzyme inputs, including algae from aquaculture, as well as ingredients or substances potentially sourced via synthetic biology. So as I mentioned, any animal-derived ingredient, the animal feed is included in the scope of review. For honey and other bee products, the bee's forage area must be sufficiently free of GM agriculture within a 4-mile radius of the hives, and any supplemental food that's fed to the bees is also evaluated for compliance. So as I mentioned briefly, the source is evaluated, and then the compliance requirements are determined by the percentage of those ingredients in the finished product. Again, these are weight percentages and exclude any added water or salt in the finished product. And processing aids, as defined by the FDA, if they're not listed on the label, they're less than 0.5% in your finished product, they can be out of scope of review. So the three main categories of percentages or classifications, we have major, which is anything 5% or greater, minor, which would be less than 5% but 0.5% or greater, or micro, which is less than 0.5%. So let me get into a little bit of what would be required now that we have some information on the source of our ingredients and the percentage in the finished product. So you may be asking, so when is testing required? Well, testing is required for any high-risk ingredients that is in your finished product at 5% or greater. This must be tested at the source level where there is sufficient intact DNA. And this testing is a PCR-based testing, and it must test below 0.9% action threshold, and it is tested at an approved and accredited lab from the Non-GMO Project. So the approved lab list is on the Non-GMO Project website. It is important to note finished product testing is not required, so it is an ingredient level source material testing depending on the percentage in the finished product. So if it's greater than 5%, testing may be required if it's high risk. There are a few other options for compliance, and that would be if it's downgradable, meaning it comes from a country where GMO regulations are in place to efficiently and consistently eliminate the risk of contamination with GM materials. If you're using a Non-GMO Project Verified version, that means that testing is already being done through the supply chain, so you would just have to submit the documentation, basically the certificate of verification, to confirm that verified status. So again, for any ingredient in your product that's greater than 5% or greater, and is high risk, you would need to submit the full ingredient composition that includes the source material, valid sampling and testing plan that includes the genetic events that will be targeted and which lab you'd be using to do the testing. Initial test results are required for the initial certification. And then they also look at documentation to verify that the input was produced under conditions designed to avoid cross-contamination from the testing forward. Again, if it is a high-risk ingredient of 5% or greater and you have a Non-GMO Project Verified version, you would need to just submit the certificate of verification and some ingredient documentation to confirm that's the ingredient you're using. And then the other option would be if it's eligible for a downgrade. If you have a high-risk ingredient and it's less than 5%, but it's greater than 0.5%, that's classified as that minor ingredient. You would need to submit for the full ingredient composition that shows that source material or any sub-ingredients. So if that high-risk component is less than 5%, let's say it's at 3%, we would submit like a specification sheet that has the ingredient statement, and then a document that demonstrates that that input comes from a system designed to avoid GMOs. And this can be something like an organic certificate or any other third-party non-GMO identity preservation system. For micro-ingredients, and again, those are ingredients less than 0.5%, the Non-GMO Project Standard has an exemption for these ingredients. So micro-ingredients that are less than 0.5% of your formula, they may be exempt from evaluation provided that any product does not contain more than 0.9% total exempt ingredients. Things that are not allowed to be exempt are GM viable microbes, genetically modified functional enzymes, or products of synthetic biology. And again, that maximum threshold for exemptions per formula is 0.9%. If you have a low-risk ingredient, then you would just need to submit that ingredient documentation that confirms there are no high-risk sub-ingredients, that it is indeed low risk, and then typically a third-party food safety or GMP certificate to confirm that it's been produced under conditions designed to avoid cross-contamination with GM materials. If the supplier only handles low-risk ingredients, there's also an affidavit that can be submitted for that. For non-risk and verified status ingredients, so for non-risk, like our salts and minerals, we just have to submit a document that confirms the source material is indeed non-risk. So for something like a salt, a specification sheet with that ingredient statement will be sufficient. For the Non-GMO Project Verified ingredients with a verified status, you would get the specification sheet that lists that specific ingredient that you're utilizing, the Non-GMO Certificate of Verification, and the Non-GMO Project web listing. So once your products are verified, they are listed on the Non-GMO Project website, and you can also source ingredients from that listing to find approved ingredients. So let's get into some information on what's required for the facility. So for a lot of our listeners here today that are with us for GMP programs, for good manufacturing practices, a lot of those principles are common to the Non-GMO Project program, and that includes traceability, segregation, and clean out. So we'll review your systems to ensure that you have practices in place, again, to track the ingredient from receipt through manufacturing and out through sale. If you have shared lines in the facility, we'll look at your practices in place for segregating those ingredients on production runs, as well as the clean out between runs. Now, an on-site inspection is not always required. It is required if your product has an ingredient that is high risk, it's greater than 5%, and in your facility you have a compliant and a non-compliant version of that specific ingredient. If an on-site inspection is required, it can be bundled with other NSF audits, including our dietary supplement GMP audit. If a dually trained auditor is available at that time, it is possible to have it done in the same time with just additional time added, or we can do it consecutively with multiple auditors. So now we're going to get into a few common dietary supplement ingredients and just look at what the compliance pathway for those ingredients is. Now as I get going, if you think of a question, feel free to utilize the chat box feature in the bottom of your screen or top of your screen to ask questions, and we'll get to that in the question and answer section. So dietary supplements have been a bit challenging for the Non-GMO Project compliance, and that's because you have to get to that source level ingredient documentation. So you may say, oh, I have a vitamin, but we would have to get documentation of what that source of that vitamin is. So let's get going. So my first category that we'll look into is our minerals and synthetic compounds. So our mineral compounds that, again, are non-risk or not derived from biological organisms, you would just have to submit a specification sheet for each of those ingredients to confirm that non-risk source. So when something is said to be synthetic, that can sometimes mean that it's made in a lab. So for the purposes of the Non-GMO Project and non-risk classification, synthetic means that it's sourced from a synthetic ingredients, from like hydrocarbons or something that does not contain DNA. Herbs and herbal extracts, those are generally low risk for plants and herb sources. However, it is important to see if there are any carriers or residual solvents or acidifiers that are also in that ingredient, and the compliance will be determined based on those sub-ingredients as well. So if it's a low-risk herb with just a bit of residual solvent, that may be exempt from review if it's less than that 0.5%. Carriers, common carriers, maltodextrin. If you're looking at a maltodextrin, we'll need to get the source material for that maltodextrin. So whether it's tapioca, which would be low risk, or corn, which would be high risk. And the same goes for citric acid or ascorbic acid. Those can be derived from high-risk ingredients, and so the source material is required for that compliance. Natural flavors. So the flavor components are high risk, and sometimes the non-flavoring carriers or additives can be high risk. Something like a propylene glycol would be a non-risk ingredient. Anything like another carrier, like we're back to the maltodextrin alcohol topic, looking at the source of those ingredients. And then the percentage of that in your finished product would be what determines what's needed for compliance. For the flavor compounds, it is required for us to confirm that none of the flavor components are derived from synthetic biology. So typically that's an affidavit from the flavor supplier to confirm that. So for vitamins for the evaluation in a product seeking Non-GMO Project verification, we need to have documentation that shows the source and production method in order to determine that risk of being genetically modified. So some that are not typically from fermentation, biotin, folic acid, B6, B1, those commonly are not from fermentation and can be low risk. But some that are from fermentation and are classified as high risk would be some of our B12, B2, ascorbic acid, as I mentioned. For our vitamin C's, beta-carotene is also high risk. That can be from synthetic biology. So if something is from fermentation, then we must evaluate the microorganism. And if it is in the product at greater than 0.5%, then we're also looking at that fermentation media to determine compliance. So probiotics and enzymes as ingredients. So this time we would look at the microorganism to see if it is from a genetically modified strain. If it's non-GMO, then the growth media and the substrates for probiotics and enzymes are out of the scope of review. And it's just looking at that microorganism. Some other enzymes that are often evaluated are bromelain, which, if it's sourced from pineapple, that's on the monitored risk list, so we would just confirm that source. If it's from papain, our papaya is on a high-risk list, so what we would need for compliance is going to be determined on that percentage in the finished product. Another common ingredient that is challenging are our capsules, so they are included in the formula weight calculations. The source is going to be integral in determining what is needed for compliance. So if you're looking at HPMC that's from wood, that's going to be low risk. If it's from cotton, that's high risk. If you've got some plant-based capsules, tapioca is low risk, cassava is low risk, soybean would be high risk. If you've got an animal-derived capsule from bovine or porcine, those are high risk, and if the capsule is more than 5% of your product, then we would have to evaluate the feed for those animals. So in that case, we would suggest finding a Non-GMO Project Verified version or one of these low-risk sources. And then keep in mind that any microencapsulations or coatings are also included in the review. So some common dietary ingredients that are derived from animals or microbial products include our gelatins and capsules, lactose for coatings, whey proteins, bee derivatives, our honey, pollen, wax. We've got our algae, amino acids, vitamin D3 can be sourced from animals. So really, again, the key to getting a successful completion of the program is to have that source documentation for each ingredient. Some other high-risk ingredients I wanted to point out were some amino acids. We've got vitamin E, can sometimes be from soy. Again, gelatin can be from an animal source. Maltodextrin can be from corn or tapioca. So again, look at those source ingredients. Even if it's high risk, it can still be compliant, again, if it has that sampling and testing in place, or can be downgraded if it's from a country that does not allow GMOs or GM products, and then also the Non-GMO Project Verified version. So let's take a quick look at some common formulas, and we'll just go through what would be needed for compliance. So for my first example, I've got a barley grass powder. So it's important to look at the ingredient itself. So for this example, the barley grass powder, we have our document that's submitted. It's 100% barley grass. So that's low risk, and that can be compliant based on, having the other documentation for the facility and ingredient suppliers, labels. If that barley grass powder was 75% barley grass and 25% maltodextrin, we would evaluate the maltodextrin as 25% of your formula. Since it's tapioca in this case, that is low risk and can be compliant. If it was a high risk source, then we would need to get additional documentation based on that 25%. So if it was 25% corn maltodextrin, we would get the Non-GMO Project Verified version or sampling. So alfalfa powder, alfalfa is on our high-risk list, so we would have sampling and testing required for this alfalfa. That's 100% alfalfa powder, so sampling and testing for alfalfa. My second example, I've got a Non-GMO Project Verified alfalfa powder, so that can be fully compliant. And then if we look at this one here, I've got 4% maltodextrin derived from corn. And so in this case, it's a minor high-risk ingredient. So that would be demonstrating through a non-GM identity preservation system. So if it's organic corn maltodextrin and I have a sampling and testing plan for the alfalfa, this product can be approved. And then last, I just wanted to point out one more example. So I've got an ashwagandha product, Wanda's ashwagandha. They are using an extract that's 100% ashwagandha. The microcrystalline cellulose is from wood. I've got a magnesium stearate that's from canola and a capsule from bovine. So you would have a challenge getting that bovine capsule verified with the animal source and then canola as well. So another example is if you had a low-risk versions of those ingredients, you source a palm-based magnesium stearate would be low risk, or a tapioca starch capsule. So that is our Non-GMO Express. I have time for maybe one or two questions, but I'm happy to answer any questions that can't get answered after the call. I'll put my contact information here. If you're ready to get started or want to get some information about pricing, feel free to reach out to me. The timeline typically is about 10 to 14 weeks. With the Non-GMO Project, dietary supplement products can be challenging, so we do have an eligibility review specifically for ingredients, and that gives you kind of a roadmap of what's required for the ingredients based on any percentage in the micro, minor, or major. And that's something that can be done just on an ingredient level or a formula level.